Good morning. We're about to get started. I just wanted to introduce myself and give everyone some housekeeping. If you have any questions or want to interrupt me for any reason, please feel free. I wanted this to be a little more interactive. I'll actually start with the demo before I go into the slides and some of the explanation as to why we did what we did. I'm Torres. I'm a senior solution strategist at Turner, working on what we call our Ignite APIs. It's our branded SMART and FHIR implementation. So we'll talk about consent here in this session. I believe all of you are interested in how we've implemented it, what we're using it for. So I'll start with some of the preface of what is consent. Consent in healthcare is very broad. It can mean all sorts of different things. It could be consent to treatment, consent to share, consent to redisclose. So there's all these things that consent can be used for. I won't go into all of those different areas. I will give you an example from New York to show you kind of the paperwork and how it translates into a SMART on FHIR world, especially with the OAuth 2 flow, when a patient or somebody authorizes an application to retrieve health data. It's not a one-to-one comparison, but you can see what consent is used for today and how we use it in the SMART and FHIR space. So this is one example. This is what's called a Hipaa authorization form in the US. It's basically a signature that says this healthcare, this organization, or this person is authorized to redisclose my health information. So this is what the form looks like. When I compared it or had the conversation with legal, because whenever you're talking about consent, you have to get the lawyers involved. When got the lawyers involved, there's HIPAA talks to, and yes, I apologize, it is US specific, I believe, but I think this applies in other countries as well. But there's 21 data points on this piece of paper that makes it legally authoritative. Things like who's authorizing the data to be released, what data is being released, for how long this data is going to be released, and the list goes on. There's 21 different data points, and this is how it translates on a paper form. So you can see there's 2 pages, the left outlining some of the nitty-gritty, and the right side being some more descriptive pieces. So these are the main attributes of consent, in my opinion. This may differ. So this is what we've kind of outlined and designed our consent implementation around. It's kind of what is the consent authorizing, when was the consent granted, and you'll see how this compares. I'll show you later the consent resource or what we've implemented, the contract resource to different FHIR data elements. So for example, when was the consent granted can be the applies attribute on the consent resource. So it's what is the consent authorizing, what is this for? For our implementation, it's the consent to share health information. When is obviously when the person actually said, yes, this person can access my data or redisclose my data. Why is this consent needed? For our case, it's I consented, so I allow this person to do something. And then what is this consent targeting? The target happens to either be a person, related person, or the health information in question here. So I wanted to show you what it actually looks like. So I compared that paper form before and showed you the 2 pieces of paper. It said had the 21 pieces of data elements. All of those 21 data elements are actually included in this form here. So this when you're talking about the OAuth 2 flow, when I talk to our clients who aren't very familiar with the OAuth 2 flow, I always compare this to Candy Crush and Facebook. So the idea is Candy Crush Health app wants to access your health and electronic record, and Candy Crush is asking you, hey, can I access your profile, your demographics? In this particular example, it's actually asking for your allergies, your conditions, your immunizations, and pretty much everything on the electronic health record. I'll just have a pointer here. So you can see there's a ... here. When we talk to our UX designers, how do you present this in something that's human readable? How does somebody at home, your mom, your sister, your grandmother, whomever actually understands this? So we actually stopped here, and you could actually click to see the full list with additional descriptions. No one understands what a condition is, right? When you're talking about your mom, your family members, or whomever, somebody who doesn't understand FHIR, or who doesn't understand healthcare necessarily, doesn't understand what these things mean. So you click the full list of descriptions, and that's what will actually explode out all of the things you're releasing to this application. And then what we actually use the contract resource for is actually building out this right-hand side here. So I've logged in particular as Joe Smart, so I'm the father of this particular family. I have a wife, Nancy, and I have 2 children, Timmy and Haley. So for each one of those relationships in Millennium, or at least in our HR, or really in general, there's a consent. I've consented, Nancy consented to allow Joe to redisclose information. Due to lack of choice for Timmy and Haley being minors, their parents are automatically allowed to redisclose their health information. So each one of these relationships is actually represented by a contract or a consent resource. And all of these particular people, so this will be the who, the target, and the ability to release information. I'll actually show you what that consent resource looks like. So this is what the architecture actually looks like. This is what the architecture actually looks like. So when we talk about that OAuth 2 flow, when you're signing in, downloading an application, interacting with FHIR servers, or the authorization server, which is profiled on SMART's profiling the authorization server in this case. You see the user downloads the application. The application is then redirected to an identity provider. So this is logging in with your social media account, or in particular with healthcare. Generally, it's going to be your patient portal accounts, so your whatever you're viewing to view your health information. So the way it's integrated with the FHIR servers today is actually the identity provider has to provide some identifier that uniquely identifies the person logging in, linking them to the electronic health record to say that this person is in fact the same person in the EHR. The reason we have to do that is because the assertion that I'm positively identified or I have an account with Google isn't sufficient to understand whether or not health information should be redisclosed to the person that's logged in. So this is where an additional step is taken, at least in our implementation, to feed in the identifier from the identity provider into the EHR to understand. We actually use patch transaction to actually feed in the identifier on the patient resource, or a related person if you're using an authorized representative where the person is not the patient. So they send in the identifier, we call it patient linking, into the EHR. And then what happens is when the person does in fact log in, and I'll show you what that looks like, when the person logs in, there's obviously some sort of trust relationship between the identity provider and the authorization server. What happens is every time a person is directed to the authorization server actually goes behind the scenes to actually query FHIR to find out if this person is in fact authorized to view data, if a consent resource is there, and who in fact the person has the ability to view data on. So when you look at this slide, this is the authorization server handling that transaction and actually displaying it in the UI. So these are the 5 contracts that have retrieved through the FHIR server. So let me take a break here and actually show you what it looks like in action. So this is accessing our FHIR sandbox, which is publicly available. So I'll have links and information at the end of the slide deck, and I believe this will be shared with everyone after. Oh, and I also forgot about this too. I guess I don't know if we're supposed to hand this out, but I don't know if you want to take one and pass it around. These are exercises to perform, understanding how to query our sandbox and understand how to query the consent resource. In our implementation, because we are VST2 for the time being, will be the contract resource. But anyways, for the slide deck that'll be provided, you'll have information on how to access this, so you'll be able to test this yourselves after the event. So this is following that OAuth 2 flow that I was talking about, that 3-layered OAuth, where I'm logging in as the identity provider. And in this particular case, it's Cerner Health, which is just our branded identity provider for our patient portal. Clients can use their own identity providers. That's why there's that linking process. It may not be a Cerner-controlled environment. We allow clients to use their own patient portals.
We allow them to use their own identity providers. Some of them do use Google, for example, as sign-ins. So there's all of those pieces that come into play when we talk about PHIR. The only piece that we are in fact control over is the authorization server. So we're the ones that are responsible for constructing this and releasing health information to third-party applications and to other people. So I was talking about that list here, so you can see these are the descriptions, these are all the scopes when you talk about consent or the different data elements. The applications requesting, you know, the patient/goal.read scope, what have you. So this is that detailed expanded list. And then you could also email yourself a copy. So one of the things about Hipaa authorization, at least in the US, is the ability to request a copy of that Hipaa authorization be sent somewhere else. So this is where I can now say, because I'm Joe, because I have consent to view Nancy's data, I have consent to view Timmy and Haley's data, I could actually now select, and I also exist as a patient in the system, I can select which record is released to this application. So this particular application is just a testing app. So you can see it's just retrieving the FHIR resources. Once I click authorize, which is the, I authorize and release this health information. So this is kind of what it looks like in practice, where you actually log in, you're redirected to the application, and you're able to view data. So one of the things I needed to caveat was, so our implementation is DST2, so there was an exercise tied to this. So I know there may have been an expectation about STU3, so that's why I wanted to talk about some of the changes that actually occurred between DSTU2 and STU3. So this is one of the wonderful things when working in FHIR, it's changing quickly. So, and this is quite frankly our own doing. We knew what we were getting into. We needed the use case. We needed to support people logging in or retrieving their data. But I think at the time when we first implemented contract, it was an FMM of 0. So we knew contract would be changing significantly or it'd be replaced. So from DSU2, there's the contract resource, very broad in scope. It was tying financials and, kind of felt like consent was kind of thrown in there for scoping usage and boundaries. So one of the things I was pretty happy about with STU3 was consent being a standalone resource. So with STU3, you have a very targeted specific resource called consent. So you can see the contract resource in DSTU2 is convey information of all manner of contracts for financial, for example, insurance policies, business arrangements, supply contracts, and privacy and security. It's been in FMM. I think I pulled this up today. So it's still FMM 0. I'm not sure if it still is, or yeah, I think I pulled it up today. So we knew what we were getting into, and you could see in the scope and usage, there's still a to-do. So we knew the resource would be changing. Wasn't as mature as we hoped, but we needed something to be able to represent those relationships, to allow people to download mobile applications, to be able to authorize applications to interact with their health data. So this is where STU3, you have a much more robust resource. You can see the scope and usage being much more robust, allowing for, I think the description is, the purpose of this resource is to be used to express consent regarding healthcare. So you can see even just the clear difference between contract versus consent, where consent's targeting, the things consent's meant for, the release of health information, the consent to share, the consent to treatment. Once again, we're not using it for those other things, but the possibility is there in allowing for the representation of those different data elements for those different use cases. So I sit on PA. It's where I spend most of my time, so I love this data model in particular. It's near and dear to my heart. But I don't know if enough people understand the complexities of just that single family and how they're represented in FHIR. So I didn't even touch on the actual patient resources, but if you throw that in, you add another 4 resources. But just Joe Smart being the father of Timmy, the husband of Nancy, and the father of Haley, that is represented by 3 contracts just for Joe himself, and then also represented by 6 related persons. Because Joe has, so everything in the related person resource is a bidirectional relationship. So Joe is the spouse of Nancy, Nancy is the spouse of Joe, Joe is the spouse of father of Haley, Haley's the daughter of Joe, Joe's the father of Timmy, and Timmy's the son of Joe. With STU3 in particular, this actually can be slimmed down to be represented by, I believe, 2 related people, or potentially 4, because the role cardinality changed in STU3 for a related person. You can have multiple roles on related person with STU3. So this should look different in STU3, but I wanted to highlight kind of how complex just the relationship of this family is represented in FHIR. So, 6 contract resources and 10 related people just to represent this family and be able to display those UIs when we're talking about that authorization grant. So I wanted to scope down and talk to just the specifics of Joe and Haley, just for, so we can narrow and focus down instead of going all over the place with 10 related persons and 6 contracts. So you can see here, this is the actual consent, or for this example is actually contract resources. So these are some of the attributes I was talking about, the what, where, when, why attributes. So you can see here, the consent was applied June 9th of 2017. It's still effective, so that's why you don't see an end date here. It's still, consent is still valid. The subject is the patient, so who is authorizing the release, or authorizing that this person be allowed to share the health data. And then you can see here the action, sub-action, and type, I believe. Subtype, type, action, and action reason are all the different data elements that explain the why this exists. So you can see here, this is a consent report. It's a SNOMED code, I believe, is using, yes, SNOMED code. It's a record artifact. This is a subtype, it's consent status is what this document's trying to convey. And then the actual action is consented. The patient consented for this person to be able to release or view their health information. So this is the actual code, I would say, but they're all SNOMED codes. But then you have the action reason, and you can see the reason gives you additional context for the consent given for electronic record sharing. So that's exactly what the father is going to do in this particular example. He's going to be able to retrieve Haley's health information electronically and redisclose it to third-party applications. You can see here, the actor is the related person here, which is Joe Smart. And you can see the text here for the purposes of what we're representing. He's actually what's called, and this is probably a little bit of a US-specific term here. We had to stand up a lot of this infrastructure for our certification requirements. One of the things that they're very adamant on is patients being able to access their health information. So one of the key parts of that text was the patient or authorized representative be able to access their health information. So this is where we really needed the consent and contract resources to be able to represent the authorized representative, right? The authorized representative can be, anyone in this room. I could say, when I go to the doctor, I want any one of you to have access to my health record. So that's where you would now become each a related person to me, and I'd be a related person to each one of you. And then there'd also be a contract consent resource available to be able to show that I authorize any single one of you to access my health data. And this is what it would look like across the board for at least that particular example. So this is what a contract query looks like. You can actually interact with this in our sandbox. I think once you'll have the PowerPoint available, you can query by identifier, but you can also just retrieve by the actual related person ID or the patient ID. So this is what one of these identifiers for those identity providers look like. It's pretty long. We use one of our Cerner awaits to assign it. You can see here is namespace of Cerner Identity Federation. So we build out this identity provider in our system. And this is the actual username or principal in what's the SAML assertion or OpenID Connect. So this is the actual user ID. But you notice the interesting thing that I like to highlight with our implementation of querying for contract is actually the under include parameters. So one of the things you notice in order to build that UI, I had 21 different data elements, right? I had an age there, I had demographics, first name, last name, all of that information doesn't actually exist on the contract or consent resource. They all live on the related person patient resource. So what we had to do and what we felt was needed to do to not have consumers of the API have to go and query for contract and then immediately retrieve patient and then retrieve related person, we tried to break it down and support under include, so that way you have the ability in one transaction to retrieve a bundle that has multiple resources in that one transaction, instead of having to explode out what it may look like here. So if we hadn't supported under include, you'd have to do 3 actions just to get all the information to build that screen. You'd have to query for contract, retrieve the subject per contract, and remember that one father had 3 contracts represented, and he's represented as 3 different related persons. So you would have had to have retrieved the contract resource, then retrieve the subject per contract, so that's once again up to 3 patients at that point, so another 3 retrievals, and then retrieve actors per contract. So you then have to retrieve multiple related persons for this one person who's authorized to view data. So that's what it would look like without the under include. These are all the transactions that have to occur between the API consumer and the FHIR server, each one being either a retrieve on actor or retrieve on subject. And with the under include, you can get that actually all back in one bundle. You would get multiple contracts, you would get multiple related persons, and potentially multiple patients. When you're querying by actor, you should only get 1 related person at least, but and this is what it actually looks like. You have the bundle, the contracts, the related person, and the patient. And I'll actually show you that here in a second, just to show you the actual query. So this is the example from that PowerPoint of that slide I showed you. It's where this is our base URL, DST2 server. This is one of our tenant keys. I'm querying for contract. I'm getting searching for an actor where actor identifier is equal to this value, and include the contract patient and include contract actor. So I click search here, and these are built out in the exercises as well, where I give you the example of Joe Smart to be able to say, who is Joe authorized to view, who is authorized to view Joe's record. So this is where you get the actual contents for that. So and that's how you run the query. This is the open sandbox. Once again, I'll provide the links in the PowerPoint. So no authorization to make, for simplicity reasons, you could just interact and just use Postman without having to get a token, an access token to get the data. So you can see here we have an entry. The first one is getting a contract. So I won't go through every field here, but I'll collapse. Another contract, remember Joe has multiple relationships. He's authorized to view his wife's data, he's authorized to view his daughter's data, and he's authorized to view his son's data. So you can see here there should be at least 3. I think because of the way I built this out, he's related to Nancy twice, so there's 4 contracts, I believe. 1, 2, 3, 4 contracts, so that's what I was showing. So and then because we did the under include, you can see here I actually have a full patient resource. This is going to be for Haley, I believe. Then we also have for every single patient that was different. Then we have the related person resource. This is where I was mentioning that it's the related person because Joe has multiple relationships outside of the context of the consent. He actually exists as multiple related persons. So you can see the ID here for this instance of the related person is 216, and then you can see 243. So within this one bundle, we received 3 patients, 3 related persons, and 4 contracts. So that's where the under include is really nice, because if you would have had to have retrieved that data, of those pieces of data, to build that form separately, you would have had to have done a get on each one of those endpoints to be able to, you'd have to go dereference every single one of those linked resources. So retrieve patient, retrieve related person, and retrieve the contracts. And then parse out the information that you need from all of those different resources. So this is what it actually looks like. It's pretty straightforward. I'd like to think we made it such that we made it that much easier to support retrieving all the information or aggregating the information by supporting the under include. back to the presentation. So that's what I was just highlighting, the showing of the actual bundle with the multiple resources within a single bundle as opposed to having multiple resources. So these are some of the links I was talking about. Cerner prides itself on being open and available. So we have a Google support group for anybody who has any questions specific to our implementation. It's just available, just a Google account. There's no really special needs or anything that needs to be done in particular to be able to access your sandbox. So you'll see this is the test patient data that I put up there that'll have the login information for Joe Smart and Nancy Smart. So you can access their health record, be able to view it, display the OAuth 2 grant flow. Cerner documentation is FHIR.cerner.com, so you can read all of our documentation, understand which resources we support. These are the sandbox URLs. We have, once again, open and secure. We have 2 implementations for patient and provider access. When we're talking about patient access, we need to be a little more careful in what we display, so things like patient-friendly displays and additional logic for supporting patient access. So what I showed you today in that authorization grant is actually patient access flows. That's the ability for a patient to add authorized representatives, be able to retrieve information about authorized representatives. So I think I'm actually ahead of schedule. So I don't know if anybody had any questions in particular about consent, our implementation, any questions about Cerner, any questions about anything in general? Shoot.
Do you also model like consent for research? For example, in the UK, you need to have explicit consent about other countries.
Yes, that's a great question. The question was, do we model consent for research? So when we so I don't know if you went to Josh's session, I believe yesterday, about Sync for Science. So in the U.S., we're in a bit of an interesting predicament, or what we've done, or kind of the regulatory landscape of the U.S. is pretty interesting. So everything I discussed is, kind of the 4 walls within the hospital. When a patient rediscloses or gives access to the health information, let's say I give you access to my health data, I'm actually crossing the walls or crossing the boundaries of Hipaa and going into the consumer space. So in the US, it's regulated by the Federal Trade Commission. So once I authorize somebody else to access the data, it's no longer HIPAA, and I'm not bound by the rules of healthcare regulations. So for us, for example, in the US, we have an initiative going on funded by the National Institute for Health. It's a precision medicine initiative, and the idea is by using FHIR, integrating this application and giving the patient control over who gets access to the data, they don't actually need any specific consent with regards to the research itself, because the patient has released their information to the researcher. I've taken that action. So when you're talking about research consent, I'm assuming you're talking about the healthcare organization releasing data for research. So we haven't modeled that just quite yet. Like I said, it's very scoped down to like patient access and what the patient's going to release. But because I'm releasing my own health data and I'm personally handing it over to the researcher, consent actually doesn't even come into play. Any other questions about consent, access, interacting with Cerner Sandbox? I know that the exercises were handed out. I know there's text, key holder text for like insert alias here to be able to query for identifier. Once you get the PowerPoint, I think everybody will get a copy or get access to this post the event. You'll be able to copy and paste the identifier, or if you want, you can find me afterwards. I'll shoot you an email so you can be able to just take the identifier and be able to query it. And I'll be floating around throughout the day, so if you wanted to try interacting with our sandbox, I'll be available. I could show you what the different workflows look like and show you what our patient and consumer experience looks like when you're authorizing an actual app to our health electronic health record.
Yeah, so maybe a question to the room. If there's, we're in the Netherlands, we have a project for consent, for national consent, and if there's anyone in the room having real life experience with consent and FHIR, that they can share with us. Maybe in the UK or...
Yeah. Yeah.
Adam, can you?
Yeah, okay, yeah, so we've started to do a small piece of work around secondary use research, use, consent, and there is a policy that's kind of being created around that to have sort of a standard national framework for opting out of use data for research, and that we are looking to put in place a national, now put in place a national repository for storing consent, prior consent resources for that. So people can opt out through various means of their data being used, and then that gets stored in a national database as a consent resource. So that's still being developed, I think, but it's coming soon.
Is that a FHIR registry?
Yeah.
So you're going to push out a consent resource to this national registry and then make it available and queryable by.
Exactly, yeah.
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 Yeah, so we have similar models, I think, in the US. So I like to think of like Commonwealth or Care Equality. It's a national health information exchange. So I've been involved recently for Cerner's participation to talk about FHIR. And we haven't quite got to the consent portion, but when I do think about these national health information, and when you talk about hospitals contributing and sharing data, you absolutely need to have a central repository for all these consents to live. The thing that always scares me a little bit is how do you update or make sure they're in sync? If I change or opt out in the health system, how do you push that back up to the national repository? You know, or if I update the national repository, how do I feed that back down into the health system so that way on a subsequent visit, you know, you're not sharing health data that you shouldn't have been sharing in the first place. So yeah, we're starting to tackle that from a health sharing perspective. Because we're so focused on, at least in the US, I think specifically, so focused on patient access and really just removing the bounds completely of, you know, the regulations that the government imposes, really just inverting control to the patients, let the patients make the decision. So that's why that Sync for Science and National Institute for Health Initiative is so intriguing, right? You've removed the issue of consent almost completely for that particular research body. The cohort's built upon patients who had to actively participate. So they log into the app and just hit donate, and all of their FHIR data is being pushed out to the central repository for research.
Yeah, but it seems that a lot of European countries, as far as I know, take the top-down approach of having a national registry for consent.
Yeah, and we've seen that.
It seems to be country-specific.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, even in the U.S., it gets to almost state and city specific. New York has much more strict consent regulations. I think that just recently, as recent as 2 years ago, because the consent wasn't properly synced down from a regional HIE down to the health system in New York City, they were actually fined $9 million because they were unintentionally redisclosing health information and keeping that consent. And that's at a locale, you know, region, city specific implementation. So even within the US, we don't even have a national framework for consent. We have some outlines, you know, we have Hipaa authorization, what's called an NOPP, Notice of Patient Privacy. We have some basic consent forms, and I think even in FHIR it gets more complex because consent can technically be used, so I think this is a controversial issue, but I'll just throw it out there. Consent can actually be used to represent advanced directives, for example. I don't consent for any advanced treatment to be done, you know, if I'm about to die or something like that. So, and I think Brian will be talking about that later this afternoon or session right after me. I forgot where. But those types of things will come into play, and it gets much more beyond just national. It could be state, city, town specific.
Sorry, maybe one more question. I came in later, but can you tell us, if you haven't already, about what's going to change in R4? Because I know that consent was rather undeveloped.
Yeah, so we talked about it a little bit for DSTU2 and STU3. So DSTU2 is actually a contract resource and really underdeveloped. It was immature. I think I showed the FMM level was actually level 0, so when we implemented it, but we had a use case that we needed sooner rather than later. We were implemented on DSTU2. And then for STU3, it's actually wildly different. It's actually a completely different resource. They stripped out the consent, healthcare consent pieces from contract and actually put them into its own resource. So now in STU3 at least, there's the consent resource, which you can now profile. I believe the BPC group in HL7 actually has a BC, I'm always going to mess that acronym up, BPBC profile on consent, which is basically your basic patient privacy consent that allows you to share your health information across healthcare boundaries. So yeah, absolutely. We talked about that early on where the resource changes from contract to consent. I don't know of all the specific implementation details that have changed between R4, but from what I understand, it's still the same resource consent still around. There might be some data element changes there. All right, if there's no other questions, I'm more than happy to, I'll be here all day for the rest of the day. If you have any questions, I'll be sitting out on the floor if you want to interact with our sandbox or test out consent. Thank you.